My name is Ross Jordan. I am the curatorial manager of the Addams Hull-House Museum. The Addams Hull-House Museum is located on the campus of the University of Illinois at Chicago and draws upon the legacy of international peace activist, suffragist, and feminist Jane Addams, and the social reformers who lived and worked alongside their immigrant neighbors to expand democracy on Chicago's near west side. The museum connects the histories of the social settlement movement and the Hull-House settlement to the present day social justice issues of our time. I want to welcome you all to the Museum and the Social Justice Public Program Series presented in partnership with the Museum and Exhibition Studies program at the University of Illinois, Chicago. This series, the Museum and Social Justice series, explores the creative potential of museums to facilitate social change and champion issues that serve the common good. Jane Addams Hull-House Museum has long been on the forefront of rethinking and transforming museum practice, and issues of social justice in museums are today more relevant than they ever have felt. In 2020, more museums than ever before are trying to address social justice issues, and the public are demanding more of their institutions. Museums also face new challenges brought on by COVID-19 that uncover some of the deeper injustices in American museums and also in museum institutions. Museums are some of the most trusted public institutions, and how they share our human story, how they build community partnerships, how they preserve our history is important. Tonight, we will hear from Elena Gonzalez, author of Exhibitions for Social Justice, which examines new curatorial work and best practices from sharing authority, inspiring action, and building solidarity. Elena will be in dialogue with museum professionals whose exhibition and programs are featured in the publication that exemplify some of the best practices discovered in her research. And I can't help but read directly from Elena's book, because this is just a great way to kind of begin some part of this conversation tonight. Museums can help disable systematic prejudices. Museums can help illuminate new solutions for distributing nourishment, environmental protection, healthcare, education, globally and locally. Museums can foment change and inspire innovation. What are you working on? And that is absolutely the question tonight for curatorial collaborations, exhibitions for social justice, is what are museums doing in this moment? What are they doing right now? Near the end of tonight's program, we'll have a chance for questions. So I really encourage people to use the Q&A function to ask questions, and we'll try to get to all of them. I'm going to turn it over to Anthony Scepter, who's the Assistant Director of Museum and Exhibition Studies program, to introduce Elena Gonzalez. Thanks and welcome to the program.
Hello, can everyone hear me? All right. So let me just start by saying thank you to Ross and the Jane Addams Hull-House Museum for letting me and the Museum and Exhibition Studies program at UIC be a part of this event. I jump at any chance to work on a project with Ross, and I am always in awe and honored to be affiliated with and a part of any program that the Jane Addams Hull-House Museum is organizing. My role tonight is basically just to do a quick introduction, and then I will be helping facilitate some of the Q&A later. So like Ross said, please make sure that you send us some of your questions, and we will happily get those, we will include those as part of the dialogue tonight. So I am here to introduce Dr. Elena Gonzalez, who's an independent scholar focusing on curatorial work for social justice and the role of museums in society. Her book, Exhibitions for Social Justice, was published in 2019 by Routledge as part of their Museum Meanings series. And as someone who works in museum studies and advises a number of students and works throughout the field, I can say that this is quickly becoming a touchstone and very important book for anyone, any museum worker, anyone interested in making museums sites of social justice. It's a very important book, and you're hopefully either already have a copy on your bookshelf, maybe as your Zoom background, or are going to learn a lot more about Dr. Gonzalez's work. Elena received her doctorate in American Studies and her master's in Public Humanities, both from Brown University. She's curated exhibitions at the National Museum of Mexican Art, the Hefeneffer Museum of Anthropology at Brown, the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage, and very interestingly, the Culinary Arts Museum at Johnson and Wales University. She's also worked at the National Museum of American History and the Anacostia Museum, both at the Smithsonian. She's also taught curatorial studies at Brown. Elena has also done work here in Chicago as an advisor for the redesign of Navy Pier. Now she's writing, consulting, chairing an exhibitions committee at the Evanston Art Center, and is co-developing a very fascinating looking project, a digital anthology called Museums and Civic Discourse. So we have a lot to be excited about in addition to tonight's panelists, to tonight's panel discussion. But that is Dr. Elena Gonzalez, and I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Anthony, for that really lovely introduction. And before I go any further, I want to also thank Jennifer Scott and Ross Jordan for making this evening possible and for organizing everything, and Cesareo Moreno, Amanda Friedeman, and Cesareo Moreno and Amanda Friedeman for joining us for the discussion, and all of you for joining us online. It's wonderful to have everyone here in my home with me, or in your home. So let's see if we're on the right. Yes, we are. So my book, Exhibitions for Social Justice, is about the ways that we can use the space inside of an exhibition, be it in a museum, a library, cultural center, et cetera, to work for the equitable distribution of risks and rewards. Although you'll hear me sort of foreground museums first and foremost as my area of expertise, but I want to be inclusive of those other spaces because I think they're becoming really important right now as people are reaching out in terms of how they make exhibitions. Slide, please. So as I was creating the book, as I was writing the book, I spoke with nearly 80 museum professionals, including Cesareo and Jennifer, and I wrote about more than 20 different museums, including the National Museum of Mexican Art, the Hull-House Museum, and the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. And when it comes to these sites, and the other sites that you see on the screen are just sort of a smattering to give you an idea of the reach. When it comes to the sites that are represented today, my relationship with them goes back at least a decade, and in the case of the NMMA, more than 15 years. Some of the research for my book actually began with my dissertation project, and back in 2010, 2011, I actually had to justify that curatorial work for social justice was a thing. My advisor said, why don't you come up with a list without looking at anything, just off the top of your head, of what museums are doing this work? And I came back with a list of 40 different museums, and these museums were all on the list. So I'm very excited that we have institutions such as these seasoned ones working in social justice for decades to provide examples for our whole sector. And I should say, a lot of the other institutions on that list, along with the NMMA, just received a very special grant that I think we will hear something about later on. Slide, please. So all museums should be working for social justice in some capacity or other. And there's a few different reasons for that. One is that museums are meant to serve the public, and the tax-paying public supports museums. So the museums need to account for their role in that space and not just serve half of the population. Another reason, though, is one that I'm trying to illustrate with this slide, which is to say we all have an informational environment, right? What each one of us thinks we know about the world right now. And that is made up of what we hear from family and friends, social media, the news, cultural institutions, movies, whatever, everything you consume. But museums are actually one of the most trusted sources of information in the United States. So that means that they have a very important role to play in terms of how we shape our opinions and how we decide to take action and whether or not we decide to take action. So I think that sort of ups the ante as far as the responsibility that museums have to act pro-socially. The other reason I think that all museums should work for social justice is that when we think about our planet and when we think about the fact that, as they say, we have no planet B, regardless of your mission, the issues of social justice, which permeate our entire existence and actually make possible our existence on the planet, should be on mission for everyone. Slide, please. So when I wrote the book, which was not that long ago, the world looked very different from how it does today. And I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. In some ways, this was because of COVID and the way that that pandemic transformed our lives overnight. In some ways, because of the awakening that many white Americans are having to racial injustice and their desire to stand in solidarity with people of color who've been working as anti-racists for centuries, and this joining together of forces to begin to really get some public attention on this work. So for me, one of the things that has changed since the book came out a year ago, and especially since March, is how relevant it suddenly seems. I say seems because the injustices we face haven't actually changed in a meaningful way. But many, many more museums are actually now aware that injustices such as racism, ableism, heterosexism, xenophobia, and other vectors of prejudice are actually their problems, and museums need to address them. And I just want to make a very brief mention of an effort that's taking place to keep museums accountable for their words in this area. Mass Action, Museums as a Site for Social Action, has launched an accountability effort to enable museums to publicly stand behind their words that they may have written in the spring in a sense of solidarity or in an anti-racist statement, and actually demonstrate that they're doing what they said they would do. So I'm going to put a link in the chat in case you all want to follow up on that initiative, because I think it's a great initiative. So I feel very fortunate to be able to say that I have a resource, one of many that are out there, and I've included several of my favorites on this slide here, to be able to bring to the table and try to help people who make exhibitions in museums and elsewhere just get on with making their institutions and society more equitable. And I was so touched when Ross read that little quote from my book, because I was very nervous about putting that in the end. That's like the last line of the book. And I was very nervous about putting that in. I didn't know if people would think it was too cheeky, but really, we've been writing and talking about this in the museum world for a very long time, and it's time now. Been time. So now I'm just going to briefly introduce the framework of my book as a way of introducing the three museums that are part of our panel today and why they were important for me to write about in the context of social justice. So in the book, I've written about exhibitions working for social justice through four main mechanisms. And the first one I'm going to talk about today is the institutional context. And that could be DEAI, welcoming, that could be the treatment of staff, visitors, and stakeholders. Slide, please. And I'm going to start with talking about the National Museum of Mexican Art, because this is an institution that has done a phenomenal job with the institutional context. And full disclosure, I did work there many years ago, and that was how I first came to know the museum. It's a culturally specific first voice museum dedicated to serving its local Mexican community. And it's a community museum and also this world-class art museum. It began very humbly in the 1980s, early 80s, when 6 Chicago public school teachers quit their jobs and pooled their own money to begin a project that would actually speak to their Mexican high school students who are not seeing themselves in a positive way at all in the curriculum in CPS. Slide, please. So The museum has always taken seriously the need for equity and its own potential to affect change. And that's woven into all of its activities, whether it frames them in terms of social justice or not, which is something that I've witnessed there. And I've just put a couple of things on this slide to show what goes into creating that institutional context. In this case, maybe it's free admission, which is the #1 way to say that you welcome everyone in your museum. Maybe it's the front of house welcome. You can come in off of the street in cold weather, in hot weather in Chicago, and you can always sit on that bench in the front of the museum and feel very comfortable that you're welcome there. And that's not something you can say for everywhere. The vocabulary that the museum uses is very important. All of the word choices on the labels are written with the idea of inclusivity and trying to find the words that will reach out to visitors and make them feel welcome and comfortable. And so this commitment I had seen had been in place over more than 3 decades by the time I started my research. And that's long and short what brought the NMMA into my study. Slide, please. So the second part of my framework is building empathy amongst visitors and parlaying that empathy into solidarity among groups. Now, humans bond to other individual humans. And this is something that Holocaust museums really know very well because they can't do their work without that lesson. We would all visitors would have very bad compassion fatigue, right? So the picture I'm showing here is an image of a holograph of a Holocaust survivor named Fritzy Fritzl, who was one of the founding survivors of the Illinois Holocaust Museum. And she's here speaking to a live audience through this Dimensions in Testimony project that the museum did in collaboration with the USC Shoah Foundation. And that may or may not be something that Amanda touches on later. Slide, please. But the Holocaust Museum is a hybrid institution. It's likely one of the last Holocaust museums to be founded by Holocaust survivors. It grew out of a storefront museum founded in 1981 as a response to neo-Nazis planning to march in Skokie, Illinois, which is actually the city with the largest number of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. So the very act of founding the museum was an activist act. The new museum opened in 2009, and it was meant to be this new type of Holocaust museum, one that connected the history of the Holocaust to other genocides and histories of mass violence, and actually broadened the reach of the stories of the Holocaust. And this was what drew me to the museum. I actually started my research there only 2 years after it was founded. And I'm showing this slide, which is the rail car in the museum, because the third element of my framework is building memories, right? If we want to, and I certainly want this, if we want for visitors to go out and take action in various ways relating to social justice, they need strong memories to fuel them on their way. And one of the best ways to create those strong memories is to provide visitors with a combination of physical experiences and intellectual experiences. And those physical experiences can include emotional experiences, which are also very physical. And the rail car is a great example of an exhibit that blends both of those things. And I should say that it's backed up by interesting display of survivor testimony as well. Slide, please. So, sorry, Ross, can I have the next one? Oh, there we are, okay. So Hull-House, as many of you may know, since it's our host institution today, is this small historic house museum with a big agenda. The museum started out as this sleepy historic site dedicated to the memory of Jane Addams, the progressive reformer who co-founded the Hull-House settlement along with Ellen Gates Starr. In 2004, the museum joined the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience and took on this mantle of continuing the unfinished work of the progressive reformers. And this is on topics as broad-ranging as labor rights, food justice, environmental justice, immigration reform, prison reform, women's rights. And I brought the museum into my study because I knew that I could always look to it as a laboratory for museological work relating to social justice. Slide, please. So the fourth element of my framework is inspiring visitors to take action. And that can take place before the visit, during the visit, after the visit, or even decades after the visit, which is very exciting to think about when you're in the process of curating a show and you're putting a lot of work into it and you know that people are probably only going to spend 7 seconds in front of every piece you put on the wall. So this is a couple of images of an exhibition from 2016, memorable year, at Hull-House called Vox Pop, The Disco Party, Unofficial Official Voting Station, Voting for Those Who Legally Can't. And I put this up today because it was a great example of a show that invited visitors to take action in the space in terms of you could vote in the space, and also resonated with actions that were happening outside the space. So maybe you are someone who could legally vote and you could go and vote. Or maybe you weren't someone who could legally vote. And in either case, you could maybe do some advocacy on behalf of people who were not legally able to vote, et cetera. Slide, please. So today we are really fortunate to have with us these dedicated and creative museum professionals representing these 3 institutions. And I'm gonna turn it over to Ross to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Elena, for that. Oop, oop, oop. All over the place here. So we're joined by 3 great panelists. I do want to remind people to use their use the Q&A function to ask questions as they come up. Our panelists tonight are Jennifer Scott, Cesareo Moreno, and Amanda Friedeman. Jennifer Scott is an anthropologist and curator and public historian whose work explores the connections between museums, arts, places, and social justice. She most recently served as the director of the chief curator at the Addams Hull-House Museum in Chicago, leading the exhibitions, community engagement efforts, and overall vision of the museum for nearly 6 years. This program is a part of her vision for the museum. In 2019, the museum was recognized with an award in excellence in diversity and inclusion and social justice by the Association of Midwestern Museums. Previously, Jennifer served as the vice director and director of research at Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, an historic site that memorializes a free Black independent community in Brooklyn, 19th century New York. Jennifer is a board member of the National Association of Museum and Exhibitions and vice president for the Association of Midwest Museums. She was appointed in 2020 by Mayor Lori Lightfoot to serve as the City of Chicago Cultural Advisory Council, and she was recently appointed co-chair of Chicago's new Monuments and Memorials Committee. Jennifer serves as faculty at the New School in New York, and she researches, writes, and lectures locally and internationally on arts and social change, the role of public memory, social relevance, and innovation strategies for museums, arts, and cultural centers. It's super great to have Jennifer Scott back with us tonight. Cesareo Moreno has been with the National Museum of Mexican Art since 1992. He has been the Visual Arts Director since 1995 and was named the museum's first full-time chief curator in 2004. Moreno has curated numerous exhibitions for NMMA, as well as at the El Paso Museum, the Smithsonian Latino Center, and Chicago's History Museum. His most important assignments at NMMA have included curating Arte Diseño Chicago, that was in 2018, a Declaration of Immigration in 2008, and the African Presence in Mexico from Uganda to the present, that was 2006. Additionally, he has curated 13 of the annual Day of the Dead exhibitions to date, and the permanent exhibition, Nuestras Historias, Stories of Mexican Identity from the permanent collection. Moreno has spoken at conferences in the US and in Mexico, and we're so happy to have him here with us tonight. Amanda Friedeman is Assistant Director of Education at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, overseeing programming for the museum's school-age audiences, including field trip content, professional development, offerings for educators, family programs, and Make a Difference, the Harvey L. Miller Family Youth exhibition. Amanda spearheads the museum's docent training program and the Brill Law Enforcement Action and Democracy Initiative, which trains over 1,400 law enforcement professionals per year. Amanda also oversees the museum's Speakers Bureau of Holocaust Survivors, Liberators, and Eyewitnesses, and is currently working to incorporate the voices of the second generation. Welcome to all our panelists, and I think I'm going to bring up Jennifer Scott to begin the conversation. And Jennifer, give me a minute here just to get this rolling.
Can you hear me all right?
I think you're good to go. Ooh. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. I think I went back to the beginning for some reason. There we go.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Great. Yeah, I think we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thanks, Ross. Thanks for the introduction, Ross. And it's great to be here with everyone, with these wonderful panelists. Also, thank you to Elena for including Hull-House in the book. As both Ross and Elena mentioned, Hull-House has this really powerful history of social reformers and radicals, begun by Jane Addams, starting this social settlement movement, whose main goal was to create social change in neighborhoods and elevate labor, immigrants, women's rights. And so a lot of the way that mission's interpreted at the museum is to connect to present day social justice issues. And so when we're thinking about, this question of pre-COVID, post-COVID, a lot of what we did, we were already in discussions about social disparities. A lot of our exhibitions are about social justice. And so the biggest difference with COVID is really that we had to close physically. But in general, this is a continuous discussion, a continuous commitment to be a site of conscience and a museum of conscience. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the museum was doing right before we closed down for COVID and then what happened after. We had opened a few exhibitions that were commemorating the passage of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So here you see the first one, which is called Why Women Should Vote, based on a 1910 essay written by Jane Addams. It talks about this history and all of its complexity. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. But we also wanted to invite the public to be in conversation and to reflect on the upcoming election, which we know is super, super important, very contested, and to be in that conversation. So we included a prompt in the exhibition that asked the question, why do you think women should vote in 2020? And we received hundreds and hundreds of responses when we were open of all sorts of people from different backgrounds, ages, genders, ethnicities, reflecting on questions of women's leadership, past and present, women's electoral power, voice, racism within the women's movement, and in women's power to impact civic affairs. All important conversations and very much tapped into what people are talking about now. Next slide, please. In the same exhibition, we included a history of Ida B. Wells, who many of you know is a journalist and anti-lynching activist, who refused to march in a segregated suffrage parade. And so her response was, I'm either marching with you or not at all. So next slide, please. So out of that, we designed an entire public discussion series about the invisibility of Black women, in particular in the suffrage movement, and connect those conversations to racism currently in the feminist movement. And so we named it after Ida B. Wells' words, which is with you or not at all. And you can see the kickoff on the flyer on the right. It was our first session when we could meet in person. We had that earlier this year in January. Next slide, please. And here you can see included on the right is Michelle Duster, who participated, who's the great-great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells. So part of closing down, we had to regroup all of our resources, figure out, you know, programming and funding, et cetera, participation, because people's lives were changing. And so fortunately, a number of these programs were in demand, and we reprogrammed for the fall. A couple of them have already launched in the last couple of months. And I encourage you to go to the website and look for the other ones coming up in the future as you start to think about this election and think about ways to be active. Next slide, please. Another exhibition that we had launched called True Peace, the Presence of Justice was also based, also social justice focused, obviously, but based on a quote from Jane Addams, which says, "True peace is not merely the absence of war, it is also the presence of justice." And this was documenting the long women's internationalist peace activist movement that happened, that was started by Jane Addams and others who were opposing World War I and who were denouncing the patriarchal nation state. Next slide, please. And in the second part of this exhibit, as we always do, we wanted to bring it up to the present and ask the question, what does international women's peace organizing look like today if there's not exactly a war that people are thinking about? And to answer that question, we worked with two contemporary artists. So you see her, Monica Trinidad on the left, who's a queer Latinx artist and organizer born and raised on the south side of Chicago. And on the right, Sarah Jew, who's a photographer, prison abolitionist, and community organizer. Next slide, please. So they created art for and from the many and civil and human rights campaigns in which they participated in Chicago over the last 10 years. And their work demonstrates how much activist struggles have been led by women of color and queer communities in Chicago in particular. And of course, a lot of the activists who are on the streets every day right now during civic unrest, who were there last night in response to the acquittal of Breonna Taylor's murderers. These are the activists who are exhibited right now in Hull-House. You can see all of their causes and what they're behind and what they think are unjust. Next slide, please. So a lot of the campaigns that are depicted in the exhibition include anti-militarization of the police and police brutality, education justice, mental health advocacy, prison abolition, trans and gender non-conforming liberation, the struggle for Black lives, indigenous land rights, immigration rights, and many, many, many more. Next slide, please. You can see here Monica Trinidad also illustrates her mentors and collaborators in struggle. She created these beautiful portraits, really powerful, of other Chicago activists that she's worked with, that she's been inspired by, that she's been mentored by, and she's linked them with causes that they worked with. Next slide, please. And this is really important because a lot of people haven't seen this. We opened it right before we had to close physically. This is a mural that we commissioned that Monica Trinidad and her artist collaborator, Gray Rosa, created, called In Progress, A Decade of the People's Struggle in Chicago. And this is an active grassroots timeline of activism in Chicago between 2010 and 2019. And in particular, I wanted you to see the last panel, if you could bring up that next. There we go. Again, we bring it up to the present and ask, how do you commit to social justice in 2020? So this was launched in March and not a lot of people got to see it. And of course, it's extremely relevant. These are what we use exhibitions as prompts for conversations and inspirations for action. And so we really wanted to make this available. Next slide, please. So regrouping, we spent a lot of the summer working with, trying to get emergency funding and trying to work with collaborators to figure out how we could at least make these works that are so relevant to all that we're going through right now and need to understand how we can make it accessible. And so we created digital access, digital tours that can be self-guided or guided by our educators with partners in the library system in Illinois State, the Chicago History Museum, many, many other partners to make that happen. And it took a little bit of pivoting for us to do that. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to share is just relevant tonight, another programming series that was supposed to launch last spring. It was something I had been thinking about for a long time, even before I came to Chicago 6 years ago, is a museum and social justice series, to constantly be thinking about the role of cultural institutions and how we participate in these conversations, in these actions. And so we were able to actualize it this year, but we had to reprogram everything for the fall. And I'm happy to say that when we reached out to everyone to regroup, it was unanimous. Everybody who was involved wanted to be involved and continue to have these discussions and even deepen them, because it seemed even more important to have these conversations. And I just want to say that, this is ongoing, this kind of work that museums are doing and should be doing. So really grateful to kick off this series with Elena's book. Thank you.
There we go. Hello. It's so good to be here. I'm in such great company this evening. I love it. So I guess, listening to Jennifer speak, there were so many great ideas that sort of were coming to mind. And I think it's important to maybe underscore, before I launch into these exhibits, sort of underscore the fact that these kinds of exhibits that we're talking about that really are relevant or matter or try to focus on inequities or social justice in society, they take a couple of things. One is obviously determination, right? The institution, I think, really needs to be determined that this is the kind of path that we are going to take together, because it's not just about the curators, right? It's about the people who do the tours. It's about the people, as Elena mentioned, the people who greet you at the door. It's all part of one group motion. And creativity, I think, as I was listening to Jennifer, creativity is definitely one of the things that is so fundamental, along with honesty. And then what the last point that I want to sort of stress that sort of came up is that it's a messy path. It's not a very clear, straightforward way. There's, as I mentioned, the creativity part of it. Sometimes you have to figure out how we're going to do certain things. How are we going to explain this to people in a way that they will understand it? Perhaps not immediately, but that they'll understand it once they start seeing and putting the pieces together. And who are the partners? Oftentimes, the partners that you choose and that you work with, that you collaborate with, oftentimes it's not easy if it's a true partnership. If it's a true collaboration, sometimes it's not, it's not a set path. It's not like an exhibition that looks at a history of an artist, for example, and you sort of understand the trajectory of their life and their career, and so it's a little bit easier to sort of lay that out. These kinds of exhibitions really do take some thinking and planning, and sometimes there are debates that happen. Okay, so this first slide that's on the screen right now is Peeling Off the Gray. That's an exhibition that we organized. It was supposed to be only in our Chicago gallery, but it got larger and it also extended into another space, the Torres Gallery. The Chicago Gallery, by the way, is a space dedicated to Chicago artists or themes. And so as the National Museum of Mexican Art, the Chicago Gallery really keeps a good part of the museum focused on the local, right? So we're not only looking south of the border to the beautiful culture and history of Mexico, and we're not only looking to the Southwest or to California, we're also looking to the neighborhood. We're looking to I always say if I can drive there within an hour, it's local. And so some of that sometimes includes Indiana, sometimes it includes other cities like Aurora, Joliet. And so this particular exhibition that opened in 2018 and closed in 2019 took a very close look at the actual neighborhood of Pilsen. Pilsen is a gentrifying neighborhood. It's been gentrifying for quite some time. And it slowed down a little bit, and now it has really, in the past, 10 or 12 years, it has really picked up speed and momentum. Buildings going up, and just really the charm of the neighborhood is really been changed by a lot of these larger 3-story brick buildings that sort of seem out of place in our neighborhood. So we organized an exhibition that looked at the gentrification topic. Certainly it is a serious topic. It's something that changes people's lives. And we worked with artists and a few activists, and these are some of the installations, photographs that we have. Sarita Garcia and Joe Mora did this great piece there were these buttons, and they invited people to take a button, only one, and they were from here, not from here, born and raised here. And so really you could sort of see as the buttons were diminishing the larger groups there. By the way, by halfway through the exhibit, we could not keep the buttons stocked any longer. It was very difficult. So anyhow, this was one exhibition that I think really exemplifies how working with the community that you represent can often be challenging. It can bring up difficult issues. So not every exhibit that we do is a celebration of our culture or of the beautiful things, but oftentimes the challenges. Next slide, please. Soon after that, in 2019, I believe it was, we had another exhibition curated by Sarita Hernandez, who is a rock star in my eyes as far as exhibitions go, and curating and really understanding the strength of art and exhibitions within a community. She created this exhibition that took a look at the 40th anniversary of a very important mural within the Pilsen neighborhood. It was the mural was called La Esperanza, which is, it's a woman's name, but it also means hope. And it was painted, it was a very competitive process to determine whose design was going to be selected. And over the course of the past 40 years, and you can see the black and white photograph on the left has the crew there, Malu Ortega on the left, and then Marco Raya, Jimmy is there, Jimmy Longoria, Sal Vega, and Oscar Moya in front of the mural as they were working on it. The curious thing, I'm not sure we would call it curious necessarily, but for the sake of a better word, I'll say curious. The artists who painted this mural and who designed it, slowly but surely, one of the names was erased. One of the names disappeared, and it was that of Malu, the only woman artist. She went back to Mexico after working many years at Casa Aslan in Chicago, teaching photography and ceramics. And then, like I said, her name disappeared. And the beautiful thing about this exhibition was that Sarita Hernandez and this exhibition really brought her name back. As a matter of fact, Malu was located in Mexico. She was invited, she came out. A lot of the things that were on display were from her personal collection. And really it was a beautiful way of celebrating something important in the Pilsen neighborhood, but also bringing back a history that had been erased over the past 4 decades. Next slide. The exhibition that we had in the main gallery after or during this time period in 2019 was Show and Tell. It was an exhibition that we brought from California. It was at the Vincent Price Art Museum. It was an exhibit that was sponsored by Getty originally when it was in California as part of the Pacific Standard Time, the exhibitions, the number 2, the second version. And this exhibition is a solo exhibit, the photography of Laura Aguilar, who identified as a lesbian. And her photographs really tell her story, but they really illustrate this woman, this person who is coming to her own and really, in the end, celebrating herself completely and her community. The exhibit was very well received in Chicago. It was the first LGBTQ main gallery exhibit for our museum. We've had pieces in other exhibitions, group shows. We've had sections within exhibitions that look at AIDS or look at LGBTQ issues. But this was the first exhibit that really was completely and totally for and from that community. It was a beautiful exhibit. Families loved it. I guess the reason why I'm saying that is because, you know, without a doubt, whenever we do exhibits like this that may perhaps challenge individuals on what community means or who is a part of your community, who is not a part of your community. We received a few phone calls for the most part before the exhibition opened. So obviously complaints came in before anybody really had a chance to even see the artwork. It was interesting to hear what they had to say. But the museum has always felt that we represent a very diverse community. The Mexican community is incredibly diverse. There are indigenous Mexicans, there are Afro-Mexicanos. It's what makes our community so beautiful. And so we really look at the exhibitions that we organize and that we host to make sure that we try to include all aspects of our beautifully diverse community. Next slide, please. So every year we do an annual Day of the Dead exhibit. Last year, I was fortunate enough to curate last year's, which means that in 2018 is when I would go down to a certain part of Mexico and look for artwork, look for artists. In 2018, I went to La Costa Chica in Mexico. That is the region that includes a little bit of Guerrero, a little bit of Oaxaca, and it's on the Pacific side. Acapulco would be the largest city nearby. And so I went to go see if there was anything that the African descendants in Mexico, if there was anything in their towns that was unique during their celebration of the Day of the Dead. The one thing that was very evident was this dance. It was a dance called La Danza de los Diablos. There's a beautiful black and white photograph that you can see here from the 80s it's when this dance really started becoming popular outside of the region. It's been a part of La Costa Chica for generations, but it was never fully accepted as a Mexican folk dance by those people who kind of determine what is an actual Mexican folk dance. By the 90s, it was totally accepted. It's now seen as a Mexican folk dance. And then you can see in the color photographs, those are some of the images that I took while I was down there. Aide is an artist along with Baltasar. You see them there on the right-hand side. They really speak strongly and firmly about their culture, about their community, and they really want to celebrate their African roots in Mexico in a lot of the work that they do. The little photograph at the bottom there is just a snapshot of part of that display. We devoted an entire room of the exhibition to the Costa Chica and the African traditions in Day of the Dead. Last thing I'll just say about this is that when many of our visitors who are familiar with Dia de los Muertos when they came and they saw this part of the exhibition, you could see that many of them were a little surprised because it doesn't look like what we've become accustomed to seeing. It didn't have a lot of the indigenous culture or a lot of the Catholicism, a lot of the Catholic icons. And so there was a little surprise about it, but that's the good thing. We like to challenge people to reconsider and think about what they think they know of these traditional celebrations. Next and final slide is the Day of the Dead exhibit from this year. So what you're looking at are works of art that you would not be able to go see in person at the museum. You could see them virtually. We're doing virtual tours, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later on, some of the major changes at our museum. But as you can see, some of the ideas and issues that have come up in society always come up in the artist's studio. The piece on the left, I am particularly fond of. I love that piece. It is by youth. They're teenagers who made this piece. They based it on piñata materials. And so you see some broken piñatas on the pedestal or the platform there. And then other piñatas that are waiting to be broken that are hanging in front of this beautiful paper sign. It is masterfully crafted, and all the ideas just come across so well. It's a true work of art created by teens. Obviously, we can see what's on the mind of teenagers by including them in our exhibitions. Salvador Jimenez Flores created these trees of life, but he changed them. Instead of having them be the traditional trees of life, he made them all about the pollution and the ecological poisoning of Little Village. Little Village is a neighboring neighborhood in Chicago, and La Villita is a place where pollution abounds. I won't go into that, it's too long of a history, but he created these sculptures that really talk about air pollution. And then the final piece on the right that I chose to include is one of the triptychs. There are 3 shopping bags that were printed by Carlos Barberena. And what he does, and obviously the shopping bag is a great idea, metaphor for consumerism, capitalism. Carlos did a beautiful print of workers, and he's playing with the idea or trying to make us think about how somebody can be essential and undocumented at the same time. How oftentimes it is the undocumented who do a lot of the work so that we can stay at home and have food delivered to our homes during this pandemic. There's a lot we could talk about with each one of these pieces, but I'll leave it for there now. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Cesareo and Jennifer and Elena. I'm thrilled to be here in this incredible company. As Elena mentioned earlier, the Illinois Holocaust Museum was founded really as an act of grassroots activism. The community of Skokie in the late 1970s had a population that was approximately 10% Holocaust survivors and their descendants. So the survivor community was a significant presence in the village of Skokie. And so when a neo-Nazi group attempted to hold a rally in the village of Skokie, this led to all sorts of things, including a Supreme Court case on the First Amendment, but also led the survivor community to really, for the first time, publicly find their voices, realize that they had not only the opportunity, but also the obligation to educate, to work for prevention, and to share their stories with the intent of teaching people not only about what had happened to them, but how to keep something like this from happening again. And so we began as initially just a speakers bureau, and then eventually had a little storefront museum on Main Street in downtown Skokie that was started by the survivors. And then 11 years ago, in 2009, we opened our current facility, which is the second largest Holocaust museum in the country and third largest Holocaust museum in the world. Next slide, please. And with this transition to our fully realized museum also came a shift in our mission and a restating of our mission. And what was really interesting is, as Elena mentioned earlier, our mission is expressly to preserve the memory of the Holocaust and the stories of those who were lost, but also specifically to use education as a tool for genocide prevention. And now that has become very standard among Holocaust museums. That is kind of par for the course, especially among Holocaust museums in this country. In 2007, 8, 9, as this statement was being crafted, that was very revolutionary and very controversial. Interestingly, it was really the survivors who believed in this mission and who pushed for it. The scholars and the historians who we were working with to develop our core exhibitions were very resistant. They wanted the Holocaust story to be central and not, as they viewed it, to be watered down. Whereas the survivor community, to their credit, saw that their stories could be a starting point for these larger and very essential conversations. Next slide, please. And so the first place in our museum that conversation happens is in our Carcomi Holocaust exhibition, which takes visitors through the kind of the chronological history of the Holocaust period. But it tells the story through the experiences, the artifacts, and the testimonies of survivors who ended up in the Chicago area specifically and in the Midwest more broadly. And so it gives a very personal spin on this massive and sometimes overwhelming history. And so it becomes a very individual narrative, even as we look at the whole. The other aspect of this exhibition that is really important and really powerful is that there's a theme running throughout of acts of resistance. The idea that at every step along the way, people were standing up, using their voices, resisting, objecting, protesting in a myriad of different ways. Some violent forms of resistance, some very nonviolent to the extreme, what we call spiritual resistance, cultural resistance, the practicing of one's religion as an act of resistance were always that the Nazi agenda and the persecution that was happening were actively opposed. And so one of the really important messages that this conveys to our visitors is that the underlying theme of history being determined by choices. Individuals make decisions about how to act, and that determines how events unfold. But these choices and these actions and these events are not inevitable. Each of us has the opportunity and has the power at every step along the way to get involved and to change the outcome. Next slide, please. For our younger visitors, another of our core exhibitions is called Make a Difference. This is a space where with school children, we work primarily with 3rd through 6th grade, and we also use this space with our family visitors. And what we're really doing here is taking the larger lessons and the kind of real world applications of Holocaust education, stripping them from the historical context and infusing that education into our offerings for our younger visitors. And so a child who is not old enough to talk about atrocities is old enough to talk about why stereotyping is harmful. They're old enough to talk about the many different aspects of their own identities and to start to think about how that concept can apply to those around them. They're able to start thinking about the impact that their decisions can have on others, both positively and negatively. They're able to start developing their leadership skills. And so we begin working at a very young age to develop these tools of good civic life in young people, to not only help them to grow up to be the types of engaged participants in their communities that we all hope to see, but also to give them a foundation so that as they progress through their education, as they start to study and learn about the history of the Holocaust, they have this understanding of humanity and of these kind of fundamental ideas that will inform their learning and help them to engage with this larger subject matter in a more meaningful way. Next slide, please. Our third core exhibition is our newest. It's coming up on its 3rd anniversary just next month. But the Take a Stand Center is a space where we take our visitors throughout. We are trying to educate them, give them knowledge, and to inspire them. This is where that knowledge and inspiration transforms into action. And so visitors move through a few different experiences in this space. It's entirely interactive. You see the first image will look familiar. That is the holographic representation of Fritzy Fritzl, who is an Auschwitz survivor and the president of our museum. And so visitors are able to engage with the holographic Fritzy or one of 16 other survivors who we have in this format. And they're able to ask questions and really engage with these survivor narratives. Then visitors move into our Goodman Upstander gallery, where against the backdrop of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we help visitors to start to understand and engage with the types of social justice issues that are being faced in their own communities, in their country more broadly, and around the world. Then through the stories of upstanders, both contemporary and historic, who are working to address these issues and to bring about positive change, visitors are able to start to identify what issues they care about, what they feel passionate about working to try to address, and gaining inspiration from the stories and the successes of this extremely diverse group of upstanders. From there, they progress into kind of a lab area where they're able to actually explore specific actions that they can take to address these issues. And so we want our visitors to leave fired up about changing the world, but we also want them to have the tools and the knowledge to be able to follow through. We don't want their inspiration and that passion to evaporate once they're back in the parking lot. And so visitors are able to engage with different activities to identify what their preferred activism style might be. Are there someone who is really ready to engage with advocacy? Are they someone who is really focused on giving and is coming from more a sort of material donation model of activism? There's no right or wrong. We just want to help people find what is going to be most resonant for them. With these different types of activism, visitors can then get a toolkit of strategies, tips, timelines, steps to take to carry out these activities, and then they can actually email it to themselves, again, so that when they get back on the L to go home or whatnot, they can follow through on those actions. Next slide, please. We have a wide array of special exhibition programming that, on the one hand, takes deep dives into specific topics of the Holocaust, and on the other, looks more broadly at issues of human rights, social justice, and civic engagement. At the moment, we are thrilled and honored to have the exhibition of the notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which we will have on view both in person and virtually through the end of the year. Next slide. And then coming up next, after RBG, if the slide will cooperate, we have, thank you, Ross, we have next spring, opening in February, an exhibition called Mandela Struggle for Freedom, which will look at the types of activism, both grassroots and internationally, that led to the end of apartheid in South Africa. Following that, opening next fall, we will have Rise Up, which is an exhibition on the LGBTQ+ rights movement from Stonewall to the present. And so we really want to engage with different communities, with different topics, and to give a forum for voices of conscience, for voices that are taking action both in the present and historically on these social justice issues. Last slide, please. In addition to our exhibition content, we also have a full slate of educational programming. We offer professional development for educators to help them to engage with these sometimes very difficult questions. We have a full slate of public programming, panel discussions like this, book and author talks, films, all of those sorts of things. In Ross's introduction of me, he mentioned our Brill Law Enforcement and Democracy Initiative, which trains over 1,400 law enforcement officials every year, including every recruit in the Chicago Police Academy, spends a full day at our museum engaging with these different subjects. And then the last image that you see is from one of our Student Leadership Day offerings, where we work with high school students, junior high, and upper elementary students to help them to hone their leadership skills, to identify the issues that they care about, and to develop action plans that they will take back to their schools and carry out to address the social justice issues that they identify in their communities. So I think that is a good place to leave it, and we can, for now, we can turn to the broader conversation.
Am I ready to go, Ross? Okay, I'm gonna take that silence.
Yes, that's a yes. And then if people have questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A so that we can answer them. But thanks thank you to all our panelists. Let's get everybody up.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, Cesareo, and Amanda, for those excellent and comprehensive introductions to everything that's going on at your institutions right now. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to kind of get the ball rolling here. The pandemics of COVID and systemic racism are intertwined. And I'm wondering, we heard a little bit about one exhibition that is addressing that, which is to say the Day of the Dead exhibition at the NMMA. And I particularly loved those pieces in that Day of the Dead slide for that reason. But I'm wondering if there are other examples that we haven't yet touched on of work, whether it be an exhibition or something else that brings these two themes together in your institutions.
Oh, I'll jump in. We had the biggest impact of COVID on our institution was that we turned everything that we do into virtual content. So we have our full slate of programming. All but one of our exhibitions is available online now. It was a very busy spring and summer for us, but we have been able to reach entirely new audiences and stay engaged with our current audiences, which is always the goal. But our one really interesting opportunity was that we had pre-COVID, the current everything, that's going on, we had been planning for the first time to hold a Juneteenth commemoration. This was something that was very important to us as a subject that we had not yet engaged with. And so we had Sherilyn Eiffel from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in conversation with Alex Koblowitz. We were thrilled, we were excited, COVID happened, and so we were able to convert it to a virtual program. We were very nervous. It was our first really large scale virtual public program, and it actually turned into an amazing opportunity for us, because by having it virtually rather than having it in our building, we had triple the audience that we would have been able to accommodate physically. And so it was a really, in some ways, disappointing that we were not able to have the program as we envisioned it, but it presented an incredible opportunity to have a much broader and more meaningful conversation.
Lots of opportunities. That's a good segue. We also were challenged in so many ways. I guess, you know, at some point you've got to sort of pivot and think about the direction that you need to go into if you are going to remain open and continue to present works of art and creative people's work. And so I think the way I sort of saw it was there was a shift from bricks and mortar to virtual, and that was reflected also in budgets. You know, so maybe you're not spending as much money on, you know, whatever it may be that you go through when you have thousands of people coming through your space, but now that savings has to be used elsewhere. And so the purchase of cameras, the purchase of equipment so that we could have quality images. And so the museum, especially the education department, you know, hats off to them. They really were able to make the turn, make this change, and pull us all along with them. But I would say the biggest change for us during this time was definitely moving from bricks and mortar and physical space to the virtual space, and everything that means. Yeah.
And I would agree with both you, Amanda and Cesareo. That was the biggest switch for us to go digital in the ways that I described. I'll just add that one of the interesting things that happened as we were considering, you know, which directions that we wanted to go, is that there was such a demand for the exhibitions that we had, because people are looking to have these conversations and looking for prompts and looking to connect with one another over the topics. So I think, I mean, we always like to think that what we're doing is valuable, but it was a really nice affirmation, I think, to have so many people reach out to us and partners and ask us to continue it. It was also felt like a much stronger accountability that we needed to see it through. And so I feel like that was a different, some kind of change that was happening in moving, you know, to under COVID to address the combination of issues.
Thanks. So another thing that I was thinking of before we go to the excellent questions that are coming through in the Q&A is just, I know we heard about a couple of upcoming projects from Amanda about the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and Dia de los Muertos just opened. Are there any other projects that are coming up, be it online or in person, that everybody should be aware of over the next year that are in the pipeline?
Well, we changed our calendars around. I'm going to be very frank. We've had 6 different versions of calendars for the next, sort of looking at the next two to 3 years. We've had 6 different versions of them, changing and pushing back and postponing. And so we are in the process of organizing our spring exhibition to replace the one that we had planned for. You know, some of the things too are, so Carmen Chami is a painter who's living in Chicago, and her solo, her one-person painting exhibit in the Chicago Gallery was about to open when the pandemic hit. And so we thought back in March, you know, we'll push it back a few months, we'll open it up with Day of the Dead. Well, you know, lo and behold, we haven't really opened the museum at all, and we won't until probably until next year. So long story short, we've continued to postpone the closing of Carmen's exhibit because people haven't seen it yet. You know, we can't just say, oh, your exhibit was up for 3 months or 4 months, and you know now it's over. So I was speaking with her recently. She came in to do a video for one of our online virtual segments, and I told her that she probably will have the record at the National Museum of Mexican Art for having artwork installed the longest. Bottom line is her work will be on display for a total of about 13 months. But we're not open yet, so can you really count it? Which is the question. Can you count the months that you're closed? It just wouldn't be fair. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a extended way is that we are up in the air. We're adapting, we're changing, and there's nothing is really set these days.
Jennifer, is there anything that came up at the museum, the Monuments and Memorials Committee that we can look forward to on the horizon that we may not already know about?
Well, we're just getting started, but I think it's a really good point that the fact that Monuments and Memorial Committee was created comes directly out of the activism that we're seeing across the country, that, you know, all of the museums on the panel are engaged in on some level in conversation with through exhibitions. And, you know, it shows the power of what you can do in terms of activism, but also thinking about, you know, this constant reassessment about the role of art is the same question around the memorial. You know, who gets to remember? What do we remember? How are we creating memorials? How are we making tributes, and to whom? I mean, one of the things I loved hearing, Cesareo, Amanda, you talk about your work, it was really making me think about how much, so much of the justice work that we do in our museums for exhibitions is picturing what's not pictured. There was all this invisibility, you know, the survivor stories at your museum, Amanda, and that people don't know about. And Cesareo, I was so moved by the mural, the name that was left out, and then how the Esperanza, how the exhibition made that visible. That's so powerful to me. I mean, these lost stories, and even the Afro-Mexican traditions of the Day of the Dead. I mean, to me, that's doing social justice just to correct those invisibilities, and that seems super powerful. So I love, Cesareo, your last question about, is it enough to have it digital, or is it a different kind of a dimensionality of experience? You know, when you're correct, if that's part of the work of justice in these museums, you know, how important is it that we also are in person to see, you know, to correct those invisibilities? Like our work, we're showing all these activists who don't get their due, who are not acknowledged in Chicago, and who are out there every day, you know, putting their bodies on the line. So anyway, long answer.
So I think at this point, we're going to go over to Anthony, who's going to just moderate our questions coming in from the audience a little bit, or provide those questions.
Yeah, thank you. So there are some really amazing questions coming in through the Q&A, and so people can keep sending them, but I've been watching them and trying to compile them, and I will offer them up to the panelists for their responses. And one of the first, some of the first questions that came in make me think that maybe what we need is just like a museum worker support group, because a number of the questions and I'll paraphrase here because multiple people asked this question in a couple of different ways, but this has been a great example of how you all have done really amazing social justice work and been successful at it. And Cesareo brought up the example of the Laura Aguilar exhibition, in which there was some community pushback. And so a few different people asked, how do you all deal with members of the community? And you can maybe take that and expand that to include whoever you'd like, when there's resistance to an exhibition, especially an exhibition with aims to address social justice.
Anybody?
I'll go. It's interesting. We get pushback in the set. Generally, if we get pushback on an exhibition, it's from people who believe our mission should be strictly Holocaust. The broadening of our lens is what some people are resistant to, and it's interesting, and we see it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to have that conversation. If they're reaching out to us to object, that means that we can talk about why these issues are relevant in our building, in our conversations, in our larger scope. We're not going to win all of them over, unfortunately, but we're gonna certainly try to have that conversation with them. In terms of the issues that we address, it's interesting because the pushback that we get, and I'll be interested to hear if this is similar for the other institutions, is that when we address issues of equity, when we address issues of human rights, when we address the idea that all human beings should be treated as human beings, we get accused of being political. And that's the world we live in, unfortunately, at this particular historical moment. But the idea that human rights, that human dignity is political, is in itself an issue that we all need to engage with. So I'll leave that there before I say something that will cross that line that I'm not allowed to
Amen,
cross.
Amanda, amen, preach it.
I just want to say something quickly about the resistance, because I think if you make the commitment to be a social justice site or to do this kind of work, that pushback is a really good sign. And so I think it's not so much about whether you'll get it or not. It's about expecting it and embracing it and taking it as a sign of a positive sign rather than a negative sign that you're on the right path. Because this is still unprecedented territory in many ways. And there's always going to be pushback. This is not, you're going against the norm. You're fighting against injustices. So this is what it looks like. So to me, I think it's a good sign. And I think we have to figure out better ways to embrace that and make room for it, because to me, it just reminds us, oh yeah, you're doing things right.
That's a great point. And I totally agree with both of you. It seems as though when we do widen that lens, that view, people don't recognize the story. And as soon as they don't recognize it, you must have an agenda, or you're trying to be politically correct, or you've obviously strayed for a reason. What they don't realize is that the narrative has been incomplete, and it continues to be. I mean, I think that's human nature. There are always stories that are left out, and to find those stories and to include them and place them in a space, whether it's time or whether it's a physical space, to place them in there and give them their dues. I think sometimes people are challenged by it. They feel that you are challenging my identity as a this or as a that, or that's how dare you challenge me and who I am by incorporating more. I think that the way I have tried to deal with it is please, and I've said this like at least I've maybe had like four in all my years, 4 phone calls where somebody stayed on the phone with me for a long time and like really was complaining. And every single time the exhibition was not open yet. And so for me, every single time I offered myself and said, if you come and see the exhibition, I would love to talk to you afterwards. I would love to even walk through with you if you wanted, but certainly see the exhibition, and then we'll have more to talk about. You'll be able to actually tell me what is wrong with this story. Obviously, I've never been taken up on that offer. So my answer to oftentimes to people is let's walk through it. Let's walk through it. What artwork or what section do you feel does not belong?
So amazing. I really love all of those responses, and especially Cesareo's response, because a lot of museums will make you give $1,000 donation if you want to walk through with the curator. Some of the other questions that we got, I'm not going to try to combine all of them, but one question will maybe lead us into some of the other questions that are really, people are very interested in you all's perspective on responding to this particular moment. But I'll start with the question that is really specifically asking, since exhibits and exhibitions take so long to prepare, how do you stay current with social justice issues when those can seem very immediate?
From our space, oftentimes it's the role of the artist. I listen to the artists. I love seeing what they're working on. I love seeing what they're thinking about, what they're imagining, and I wholeheartedly believe that if it's something that's in the studio of an artist or in their mind of an artist, it's part of the community. There are households who are thinking this. There are other people who are also feeling this, and so I think it's a matter of trusting contemporary works that are being created now, looking to fit them in a certain way. And I guess that's the role of the curator. How do we fit them into the narrative that we're curating? But ultimately, it's a trust. It's a trust of the artwork and the artists and their role in the society.
Can I jump in for a second too? I also want to say, and I think, the way that Hull-House has structured this over the years has been really insightful. So many of the issues that we feel are most pressing today are not new issues, right? None of them are actually really new. The question is one of this fleeting public attention. And the way that Hull-House sort of looks at what the progressive reformers were interested in and looks at what's happening with that today, I say is insightful because we see where change has happened and we see where there is so very much change that still needs to happen. And so I was very scared about that very question when I was producing my book because, everybody's got a blog and everybody's on social media and it's so fast and it's instant. And I was worried that my book was actually going to be like out of date and passé by the time it was published. But I'm really, really sad that it's still really relevant. And it turns out it's just, sometimes a matter of encouraging people to examine the past in tandem with the present and use those things to think about the future that they want to build.
Elena, you read my mind. I was thinking about it being a history site. You're always making those connections, and especially, unfortunately, these injustices, a lot of them outlive us, and they're not going anywhere. So you can plan, counter to what people think. You can do long-term planning at social justice sites. I think it's important to have a balance because there's a lot of upsides to being immediately responsive if something happens, to do a teach-in or to do a mini exhibition. So I think it's important to balance being nimble with long-term planning, knowing that you're not, you can't predict the future. Well, maybe some people can, I don't know. But you don't know what's going to happen, but most likely a lot of these issues aren't going away. They just change forms, or they might improve a bit, or have a different shape. And even as they change, you want to be nimble as well. But I think there's a lot you can plan, because there's just not, they're there. They've been there for a long time. So, but I think it's also good to be you know, immediately responsive and to balance it, because there's a lot of energy in that. There's a lot of energy in being responsive, but you can't, you know, it's harder to fund, it's harder to plan, it's harder to meet capacity. So, you know, we were always trying to strike a balance.
Yeah, and that, Jennifer, I think is where the programming side of museums is really effective, because that's the area where museums are very, or have the potential to be very nimble. Some are more nimble than others, but exhibitions, even working directly with artists, needs lead time. A program, whether it's a teach-in or something more formal, doesn't necessarily need that. And so that, for us, that's the opportunity that we have to be responsive, even as we're connecting to these larger historic context of these issues, because as you've all said, it's really nothing new, but we can engage in different ways.
Thank you for those answers. And like I said before, I want to sort of bring in, that was a great way to set up some of these specific questions that people have been asking in the Q&A about this current moment. And so someone asked very simply, you know, are you all collecting and working to tell the story of this moment? How are you addressing this moment from your sort of institutional and sort of critical perspectives as scholars and workers in this field? And then also, maybe a more specific question is, do you think some of the changes, things like virtual exhibitions and Zooms from our apartments and houses, are going to continue to be something that, you know, you can answer individually or for your institution, or your opinion about this for the field? Do you think some of the changes that and adaptations that we've made will stay with us? So how are you all thinking about this moment, whether that's from your perspective as critical scholars and activists and workers in this field? And do you think some of the changes that we're seeing now will stay?
I know that we are all thinking about collecting, and oh, that's a great piece, or it represents this moment perfectly. So the thinking is there, and the desire is there. What is difficult now is getting your hands on that object, right? We're in a time where you can't just go pick something up sometimes at an artist studio or at a collector's home, or so that social distancing is what makes it a challenge. But we certainly are going to be collecting and will continue to sort of document this time period. And I forgot what the second part of it was. I'm sorry. Oh, things that will remain.
Yes.
Yes, I think, you know, the museum that I work at is what we have around 30 full-time staff, so it's not a really huge museum. A lot of those people are you know, part of the facilities and whatnot. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that we've always been a brick and mortar kind of place. We are really concerned with how we handle the artwork, how we put up the exhibitions and what it looks like, and if everything is translated perfectly and beautifully. And we've neglected our website and our virtual space. It's been on the back burner. It's not taken, we don't have the funds and the talent or the organization to really tackle that. So now, you know, we need to do a little catching up, and we've got some lessons to learn. And I think it's pushed us in the right direction. And I can't see it becoming irrelevant or unimportant after all this. So yes, there are definitely events and hands-on activities and YouTube and all of that will remain.
We, in terms of collecting, we have our physical collection is governed by a very strict collections policy that is specific to the period of the Holocaust and a little window before or after. So the current moment is not something that we are able to physically collect in terms of artifacts. But what we can and do collect is the stories, the experiences, the narratives, the engagement. And so we have more of a, almost more of an ephemera kind of 4D, but not in terms of like an actual archival video type of 4D collection. But so that's how we're engaging on that level. In terms of longevity of this, I think it's unquestionable that this is in many ways our new way of being. I think similar to Cesareo, we had always been very focused on our building and driving visitors to our building to see our physical space. And we were very aware of the limitations of that, not only our physical capacity, but our location. We are, kind of out in the suburbs in a place that is not public transit friendly. And there were a lot of very good and valid reasons that that decision was made, but it's a decision that has consequences for accessibility and for it really in some ways drives or at least influences the demographics of our visitorship. And so being able to offer programs virtually, being able to have this this remote presence has really expanded our reach and expanded, really democratized our access to our audience.
Maybe Jennifer and Elena, as scholars,
Sure.
how do you respond to that?
I just wanted to add to that, just in general in the field, collecting is, it's very expensive and time consuming, and it's a really important moment where there's a lot of collections debates, I think, to consider in terms of collecting. But I also would hope that if things are being, actually, let me back up a little bit. In this moment where so many people have lost their jobs and are furloughed or worse, and museums are not planning on reopening, it's hard for me to think about that without extra capacity and what's involved, and think about priorities. And so I would hope that if that is being put on the table, that other things are also being prioritized in terms of supporting staffing and labor and in general, and that if there is a collecting initiative prioritized about the present moment, that it's really giving a lot of thought to the most vulnerable communities and the most lost story, invisible communities and stories. So that's just sort of my hope for the field. In terms of this being the way, I don't think anything's ever going to place in-person experience, I hope. But I never consider myself as much of a virtual person, really. But I must say that the reach and the accessibility to a lot of the programs, I feel like I watch more things online than I ever would have been able to attend. Some of them have been fantastic, really high caliber. So I do hope that some of that actually remains in terms of it being a kind of connector that feels really good, but also the reach of people who wouldn't necessarily come to your museum or, to be in conversation with. It's really exciting. I mean, just seeing all the students who've signed up for tonight's discussion who wouldn't come to our museum, because they're living in different states. So I do hope some of that stays, which surprises me about myself, but.
Thank you. Elena, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the accessibility point that Jennifer was making is really important, because it's a great example of a moment where something that actually makes the work that's being done in museums and by museums accessible to people with disabilities also makes it accessible to everyone else in a whole new way. And so I'm hoping that one lesson that will stay with us is one of universal design or accessibility for all, that can help us sort of take advantage of some of these interventions that we've had to make because of COVID that maybe should have been a long time coming, although I completely do not think that the in-person experience is on the chopping block here. Yeah, I think that's an important point. Should I go to one last question, Anthony?
Yeah, I just want to say that's a really great point, Elena, about the way that we should all maybe have already been thinking about this, but now we've been forced to think about some of these access issues. And So great point. Yes. Yeah, let's do one last question. Did you have one that you wanted to do? Okay,
I
great.
have a special one for everyone who has hung in for this long. So we had this idea to create a goodie bag for everyone to take out into the world from this party tonight. And in the goodie bag, we would like for there to be a question from each of our panelists that can help to guide our institutions as they reopen fully or reopen partly, or we go through this journey of reopening. So I'm wondering if we can hear those questions that will take us out into the night. And also, I'm going to put an item in the goodie bag in the chat for everyone, which is a link to the tables in the back of my book, which I've put on my website to help people match curatorial tactics and strategies with the actual goals of the museum. So you can just print those out and take them into a meeting and brainstorm with them. That's my hope. So go ahead, if you have your special question, now is the time to share the special question.
You want folks to just put that in the chat?
I think we should say it and put it in the chat.
Okay.
And I'm gonna put my little link in the chat, which will just give you the tables. But yeah, I think it's this is a time when everybody, museums are in a, as they say in baseball, a rebuilding phase. And so any questions that can help feed that?
So we're supposed to say our questions now?
Give the question,
Okay.
give the
Sure.
question.
Okay, so I guess if I were to challenge my colleagues and my peers and myself as a curator, once things kind of reopen and we go back to a semi-regular life, I guess the word I keep hearing often is unacceptable, right? So many things seem to really be unacceptable, yet we continue to accept them. And so I guess for me, I really hope that when we all go back and we start having regular meetings, that we all check ourselves or our committees that we sit on or our boards or whatever, and maybe just have a frank conversation about what is unacceptable for this institution. And, you may start somewhere far away, but then, the challenge then comes is, well, what else is unacceptable? What else do we need to address? And not start thinking like, how do we address it? Because that's a whole other can of worms, but just naming it, just say it. What is unacceptable? And start from there, because there's a lot.
Thank you. That is definitely a good question. I put it in, I'm gonna do for the others what I did just now for you, which is type it in the chat while you're saying it, if that's okay.
Oh, well, thanks, Elena.
I'm a naturally a note taker.
I'll go. I was, I'm constantly trying to think of questions to help cultural institutions, including museums, think about how to take advantage of this momentum of institutions assessing themselves, related to Cesareo's great question, like, what are some ways to do that? And thinking about how a lot of museums actually probably won't reopen or will reopen in some kind of limited capacity. There's a question about how disposable a museum is in terms of its work. And so I crafted this question, I cheated because it's kind of two questions in one, but just to measure your impact, if you don't open, what would the world miss if your museum remained closed? And what would you want it to be missed for? Because it might be missed for something you're not that proud of. So, you know, in a notorious way. So thinking about the value places add, and you add, I think, yeah, just trying to create a question about self-assessment for places, and, you know, what are you adding to the community and landscape?
Yeah, and that's very real, because if a third of museums are not going to reopen or are going to merge or end up in some other radically changed format, that's like a hard look, but a necessary look.
Absolutely. And those are two really hard questions to follow, because they're both so important and so at the core of what we do. And so I'm gonna, I think, go in a slightly different direction, but that kind of addresses and aspects of both of those. I would encourage museums, as they're those two very important questions. Each institution has a voice and a vision, to think about putting ourselves outside of ourselves, of our institution, and trying to get both engaging perspectives of so-called outsiders from our, what we consider our core, but also kind of trying to think about not just how we want to see ourselves, but how we are at being really honest about how we are perceived by audiences who are not necessarily the obvious core audience for our institution. How are we actively engaging with broader communities, and how are they receiving our efforts? Because we
I think
We're frozen, I think.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
We
seems like
lost Amanda.
lost Amanda, but I think I have the gist.
Cliffhanger.
I think I have the gist of her question, which is to say, how are we viewed? How do you get seen from the outside?
Mm-hmm.
Oh dear. Well,
Oh no. Amanda, well,
I'll leave
hopefully
it to you, Ross, what
hopefully
the
She
next
came back last time.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, she did. I do want to thanks folks for joining us this evening. We didn't get to all your questions, and I'm going to save them all. We'll try to get them on our social media feeds in the future. So don't worry, we'll send them out to Amanda. I know there's some specific questions to Amanda that we didn't have a chance to answer. There was a couple of specific questions, I think, to you, Elena, that we didn't have a chance to answer. And so we'll absolutely be in touch with you all on the back end. And with that, I do want to thank our panelists.
Can you, oh yeah, good.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank our panelists. And I want to really remind people too that they should reach out and, oh gosh, I have to go through all these things just to get to the last slide here. You can tell this isn't my first time doing this, I know. I want to thank all our panelists, Elena Gonzalez, Cesareo Moreno, Jennifer Scott, and Amanda Friedeman, who hopefully will come back to us, and Anthony Scepter for managing our Q&A and asking some follow-up questions. I would really, if you all enjoy this conversation and want to come back and spend more time with us on October 22nd, we're talking about art and feminism in Chicago and how feminism is really central to some of the artistic developments in Chicago, especially around feminist organizations and groups of women in leadership. So we're talking about that in art, in different arts institutions. And then on November 12th at 6 p.m., we're going to be talking about museums and schools. And there's a great effort in Chicago right now to kind of transform the Latinx representation in the Chicago History Museum. It's really fueled by some activism by students at a local high school here in Chicago. So a lot of that energy, that activism that actually founded institutions like Holocaust Museum in Skokie and the National Museum of Mexican Art are fueling some of the changes in museums today. And so come back and join us for that conversation as well. I also want to encourage folks to follow Elena Gonzalez, purchase her book at Seminary Co-op Bookstore, which is at semcoop.com. which is an independent bookstore here in Chicago that we love supporting. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to our panelists. And thank you to Anthony Scepter for joining us as well. And we hope to see you all again online at wholehousemuseum.org or at our next conversation in the virtual world. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anthony and Ross. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Panelists. Thank you, audience. Thank you, everybody.